Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another thing where I talk about things. Today I want to talk about political stability or state stability, stuff like that. I've been reading a lot about politics, a lot about political institutions, watching the news. We've got the elections coming up, and the elections have been kind of interesting. I've actually sat down and I've watched like Trump for, he'll do like these 2-hour speeches or whatever, and I've sat down and I've watched him. And like a good hour of his speeches tend to be dedicated towards throwing people out. Like, I was cooking dinner in the other room, and I would come back, and I would, like, see, oh, what's Trump doing now? And he'd be sitting there and be like, throw him out, and then he'd talk about throwing this person out. This was a big deal for him. I threw this guy out. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, at this other place I went to, I had to throw these people out. Let me tell you what that was like in comparison to this time when I have to throw people out. Oh, what's that in the crowd? Another person, throw him out, throw him out, throw him out. So Trump, he gets like half a speech, and then the other half is just throwing people out of the audience. The guy's he's kind of a circus act. Like, the press is just enamored with him, and I think that a lot of political experts, they're really not sure what to do about it, because Trump has always talked about running, and I think a lot of people are rightfully under the impression that Trump is just running to like sell a book. But right now, people are so fed up with our rank-and-file politicians. They're tired of the gridlock in Washington. They're tired of Congress just being a mess. They're tired of the doublespeak where they get up there and they're just like, yeah, oh man, I really care about the middle and lower class and things are not going so well. And then they just get up and they either raise taxes on the middle class or they cut taxes to the rich and increase sales tax. These are the only tax plans that you really get is they want to cut taxes for the rich. It's always just for their buddies up at the top. And anyway, though, I've been reading about the rise and fall of historical political institutions, and you find that there are some parallels between what the U.S. is doing. But the more I read, the more I realized that actually the parallels that you see, these are just historical things that have gone on since pretty much the dawn of written history. As far back as like China, which was the first official state, you've had some of the conflicts that you see in politics today. Basically, it's just that you've got these wealthy elites that have a lot of influence over politics, and they come in and they say, hey, I need tax exemptions and laws to help me out, because I'll support you. You have my back, and you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and together we will kind of wreck everything. And a lot of states actually fall because of this, because they wind up with the elites get to be a little bit too influential, and they undermine the tax base, or they get into these weird schemes where the peasantry gets, they just get rolled over for too long, and eventually people start to kind of starve, and they get uppity, and they grab weapons, and they go to war. But in the modern era, there are some states that are just bizarre, where you would think that they would revolt, but they kind of don't, or things just kind of stay hectic and unstable for a long time. India being a good example. This is one it's been a democracy for, a good while now. But by all rights, India is not a very stable. There's a lot of gridlock in India, and it's because they've got a very interesting. Their caste system is set up to where, regionally speaking, like different parts of India are much more independent than a lot of other countries. In a lot of other countries, you wouldn't really see so much independence regionally in other countries. Like in the States, like the city of San Francisco is not fully independent from, the rest of the country. Whereas in India, you have some regions that are pretty much self-reliant. And this is because of the way their caste system works, is everyone is supposed to be doing very particular jobs for the community, and they're sort of built up so that everybody is internally reliant. And actually, if you go back in history, there's really not a lot of written history because of their caste system. You find that if you go back and at the very beginning, the priests were pretty much the only ones who were able to read and write, and so they write a lot about spiritual duties and whatnot. And they did have an empire for a while. It was run by the Emperor Asoka, but this empire actually eventually collapsed, and it collapsed because there really wasn't a whole lot of unity in India. They never standardized measurements, they didn't standardize language, and so they had a huge empire for a while, and then it just kind of eroded. And then some invading armies came in, and they took over parts of India. And India has always been very disjointed and difficult to rule. So this has been a democracy, though, for a while, and it hasn't fallen apart, even though some analysts feel like maybe India might have fallen apart by now. So it's difficult to predict these kind of things. And of course, you've got states like North Korea, where North Korea has just been going along, and by all rights, I mean, they're not sure why nobody in North Korea has revolted yet. but that's partly because they don't have anyone in North Korea who can actually go and see, like, this is what it's like for the peasants. Like, they can't get public opinion and really form an idea of, like, what do the people believe and what do they not believe. You occasionally get dissidents who come out, but you find that dissidents coming out from North Korea, they actually believe in the divinity of the Kim Dynasty, the Kim family. Like, they think that the reason why the country is in a state of disrepair and why it's falling apart is because the Kims are being deceived by the higher-ups. So there's a certain amount of indoctrination, and just, like I say, it's another sort of thing. Like, you'd think that there would be some kind of revolution, that they would turn it over and the North Korean state would collapse, but that hasn't been the case. And of course, there's also more politics involved in that, but it's not really relevant to the whole idea of a political collapse. So I've been paying attention to the U.S. politics, and there are a lot of people, like, I think maybe less educated people on the nature of political organization, who think that the U.S. is headed towards collapse. And they often talk about the U.S. going to be like Rome. You know, it's like, oh, we're in decay like Rome. And pretty soon we're going to we're going to collapse. Our empire is going to collapse just like Rome. But this is actually a really inept comparison. I believe that people always want to go back and say that we're like Rome, because in U.S. schools, we always talk about the Western republics and the Western democracies, and Rome was the one that we always come back to, Rome and Greece. You know, they say, like, Rome and Greece, those were the first real democracies, the first, you know, and we talk about them in terms of being like the first states that really mean anything, because they were democracies, or representative democracies, republics, stuff like that. But Rome was actually a little bit strange, because Rome, a little bit similar to India, when they spread out and they conquered all these other lands, they didn't really establish a Roman identity on any of the lands that they conquered. They took over these people and they extracted taxes from them, but they allowed all the municipalities to continue to kind of govern themselves. They were like puppet states. And so essentially they were the same cities and same cultures that they always were, just that they were paying money to the Romans. They weren't like citizens. They didn't get to vote for the most part. The only people who could vote were the Romans themselves. So the democratic system that Rome kind of ran on, it was very Rome-centric. And the reason why that fell apart is because the taxes were too high and nobody had any real connection to Rome. It was kind of like, well, you know, we govern ourselves and anything that we do is pretty much, you know, for us. And then we pay all this, you know, these stupid fees to these politicians, these Roman politicians, so they can make Rome better. You know, it didn't really come back and benefit the Roman territory so well. So as Rome kind of decayed, and it started to turn a lot towards infighting among the armies. Like, you found that the generals had major stakes in politics, and they would fight things out. And this actually created problems as Rome started to sort of decay. You got like uprisings in Anatolia. Hannibal came in, and so, for example, like in Anatolia, you had generals who would go out to go and put down the uprisings, and then their throne and their seat of power would be threatened back home, and so they would just pack up and leave. They'd go right back to Rome, and they try to fight with the politicians again, the senators. They'd just be like, oh, you can't do that, you can't take away my power, like, you can't say this or that. And so, the uprising in Anatolia would just continue, and Mithridates, the king of Pontus, actually survived based on this. The guy had a lot of money, and so he would kind of rise up and he would make some gains and then get beaten back. And then the Roman generals would get upset and they would go back home to Rome to fight for their political power. And then Mithridates would spring back from his defeats because he had time to recover. And then another general would come out and they'd fight with him, and then there would be some kind of political thing. And it just kept going back and forth like this. And so Mithridates was an uprising that just endured for a long time. And then at that same time, they had a slave uprising where the slaves finally got sick of being slaves, and they got arms and weapons and tried to go and march on Rome, and they had to be squashed down. So the Roman decay was actually kind of more like Rome itself was a small core with a bunch of branches, and eventually all those branches started to die, and the trunk of Rome then kind of just shrank. Eventually became the Holy Roman Empire, but they never really rebuilt Rome. I mean, there wasn't a strong sense of unity, so they never really could have rebuilt Rome. So if you look at the states and you compare the states to Rome, and you say like, oh, the U.S. is going the same way as Rome, there's almost no similarities at all. Like, the U.S. is never gonna fall apart quite like Rome did. Every state in the Union is part of a national identity, and everybody thinks of themselves as Americans and U.S. citizens. We all have the right to vote. We pay taxes, and the federal government does do stuff for each of our individual states. You've got state powers, but the states are doing their own things, and the states are definitely not fully independent. everything is kind of interdependent on one another. So it's kind of a little bit more apt probably to look at like Chinese history and say when they collapsed, kind of how did that look and what was that more like? Because China was closer to a more modern state back in its day. The very first state, I talked about this in the last personal time when I was talking about law, tradition, marriage, all that stuff, was the Qin Dynasty, Qin Dynasty. So I've been corrected. I always pronounce these names wrong, like I say. I'm really fond of East Asian politics. I've got a bunch of books on it, but I always pronounce all the names wrong. So anyway, though, yeah, the first dynasty was the Qin Dynasty, and they were very focused on legalism, and they were like the first state to really appear. They evolved out of a period of strife, and then Emperor Qin Shi Huang decided to abolish a lot of the land ownership rights of the old families. He tried to transition everything over into a very centralized, very bureaucratic sort of state. And he achieved quite a lot through doing this. He actually managed to establish a certain sense of unity in China, but because his laws were so strict, people actually they got sick of it. It was too strict. I mean, you got killed for just about everything. The law said like everything is met with the death penalty, because they assumed that if they were super strict, then everybody would do everything that had to be done. And they did achieve some great things. They built the Great Wall. They built the Terracotta Army. You know, they established a pretty formidable legacy. But ultimately, though, it was way too hard on people. They got sick of it, and eventually they rose up and they overthrew the Qin Dynasty. What came next was the Han Dynasty, which lasted for quite a long time. And the Han Dynasty is important and notable because the Han Dynasty is where you really start to see the elites kind of bouncing back. And here's where you see the parallel between U.S. politics and these politics of antiquity. And of course, things are different. The Han also fell apart for reasons that are relative to the time period. There was spats with the eunuchs, for example. The eunuchs used to hang out in the emperor's court, and because they weren't worried about their own lineages, you know, they didn't have to have kids, they weren't going to sleep around with the emperor's wives or anything like that. They were trusted to do a lot of legal activities. You know, they went around and they took care of various paperwork duties and so on and so forth. But they actually obtained a whole ton of rights and extra privileges when they helped an emperor kill one of his relatives or something like that. I can't remember what the exact issue was, but it was like someone was plotting to kill the emperor, and then the emperor got the eunuchs involved, and the eunuchs helped kill this plot. They helped kill off the progenitors of this plot. And after that, the emperor rewarded the eunuchs by saying, "Oh, great, okay, you guys get all kinds of privileges and lands and rights and titles and stuff like that." And so then the eunuchs became kind of this entity with stakes in the game. Instead of it sort of perverted the idea behind the eunuchs and made them the opposite of what the eunuchs were supposed to be. So once the eunuchs got stakes and everything, they started to create a whole bunch of problems, and then they kind of had to tamp down on the power of the eunuchs and yeah, so you got some weird stuff going on in the Han Dynasty that you can't compare to the U.S. But one thing you can compare to the U.S., though, is that to get the Han Dynasty established, what they did was they had the families that had lost their land or had lost their power under the Qin Dynasty, and they were brought in to help overthrow the Qin. And when they did so, they got their land back, and they got back some of their title and some of their power. It wasn't to the same full extent that they had prior to the Qin Dynasty, but essentially they got enough power back to where they could be influential and they could start doing things. What this resulted in, though, unfortunately, was that wealthy families were able to buy up more land, and they were able to do more farming, they were able to get more fertile land, they had access to the best land, and what wound up happening was they produced more money than people with inferior tracts of land or people with less land. So what they would do then is they would go along and they would buy up land from the peasants that had less holdings and needed money. And a lot of times it was very common for them to get wrapped up in debt schemes. That's what this is. They would do predatory lending schemes where these wealthy families would go to these peasants and they would say, oh, I see that you need some money, like to afford your farming equipment or for this or for that. And they would give them, you know, a loan. And they would say, all right, so if you don't pay me back by this time period, I'm going to come in and I'm going to just take your farm, or you're going to be a slave, or something like that. They would have these legal defaults. And sure enough, they would give these loans out to families, and a family would have like a bad harvest year or something like that, not be able to pay back the loan, and they would just lose the farm, or they would be pressed into slavery, or something to that effect. And the longer this went on, like the Han Dynasty went on for hundreds of years. So over the course of this hundreds of years, you kept seeing this happening where these very big families, these very wealthy families, would continue to buy out farms or use predatory lending to get a hold of land that they didn't previously own. And they kept expanding and expanding and expanding. And the bigger they got, the more that they pushed for tax exemptions. Because, you know, like you can imagine, we have this rhetoric today, like I'm a job creator. Look at it, like I run a giant corporation, I employ thousands of people. You know, all these people are dependent on me for food and everything else. Like if you tax me, you know, this is, you're taxing, you know, thousands of people. Like you're making it harder for me to pay my people below me, and so on and so forth. So they'd have these arguments, they would go up there and they would say, I need tax exemptions, like give me a tax exemption. And so the government would see these tax exemptions to the rich. And then you get a continuation of the snowball. The upper class got to keep more of their money, and so they used more of their money to acquire more stuff. And this is kind of where you get into what's strange about economics. You get very ideological. Like in the States, ever since the Cold War, we've been really hard on state intervention in politics. Like Europeans don't understand us on this, but we had an era where people were being hunted down essentially for having communist ideals. So socialism became very frowned upon in that period. And so today we're kind of looking at it and we're like, should we make healthcare public? And you see all these cries of older folks especially are just like, no, that's communism. Like communism is broken, everything is wrong. And so theoretically, like if you look at China and you say like, oh yeah, all these independent, I mean, they were families technically, rich, wealthy families, but they were corporations in a sense, just in a more primitive way. So what was wrong with these families buying up all the farms? They were clearly more efficient. They were able to absorb more financial damage. They had lower taxes, so there was more wealth, you know, and I mean, sure, the people were slaves, but they had a home, you know, they had roofs over their heads. Well, the trouble was that what's good about capitalism is that if you have a new innovative method of doing something, then companies competing are really good for each other. Like suppose you're building cars or whatever, and most companies are doing cars in one particular way, but it's sort of inefficient. Like the cars pollute a lot, they're not very fast. But then you have one car company that comes up with this really innovative new sort of engine idea, and the engine is more efficient, it makes the car more powerful, and they start selling all these cars, and the cars sell really well because they're objectively better than all the other cars. Well, the competition, you know, the innovation makes it to where all these competing industries are good, and you actually want this company to sort of rise up, because what you'll find is that the company that's doing this engine idea will get ahead and they'll start to rise up and they'll buy up all the companies that don't adapt. And this is good because when they buy up these little companies that aren't adapting, that are still using the old crappy engines, the company that's building the good engines will then make those little companies or smaller companies, weaker companies, use the better engine. And so you sort of get innovation by buyouts and mergers and stuff like this. So it can be good. This is one thing that people who are very anti-capitalist forget, is sometimes mergers and getting bigger and growing up, it can be good. Because if the company is getting bigger because it's more innovative or because it's doing something that's just inherently better, then this can spread your idea and make it better. And of course, other companies that see this happening will get with the times or get bought out, they'll get defeated. But ideally, they'll get with the times and they'll make their own competing engine, and then you'll get back to kind of the status quo where everything stagnates out a little bit until your next big entrepreneur or your next big innovator comes along and has a better engine, and you continue to get better and better and better. But the trouble is if you're in a time period where everything is kind of at its maximum, like if you're looking at farming and you're saying like, okay, so all the farmers are kind of using the same method to do their farming, and if one company buys up a small company, there's really not going to be a change in innovation, there's not really going to be a more productive farm. It gets to where the big company is just sort of stamping out the tax base as it buys these things, because it's got all these tax breaks and everything like that. It's got all this influence and all this power. They kept passing all these laws. And so they just buy up land, and then the family that was working the land, you know, they're still producing exactly the same amount, but now the larger company that bought them is essentially rent-seeking. Now they're sitting on them and they're saying like, you know, well, previously you might have earned an average of like $10,000 a year. I mean, I'm just making up a random number. You might have earned $10,000 a year on this farm when you owned it personally, but now that I own this farm and I know that it makes an average of $10,000 a year, I will just pay you $8,000 a year every year, and that'll be stable, and that's fair. And so on average, basically this peasant is being robbed of $2,000 per year, but you know, there's a little bit more stability. I mean, it's like it's not good, it's not great. But of course, if this large company really wants to be an asshole, they could just pay him $5,000 a year. They can kind of clamp down on their wages, or just let the wages stagnate. You know, like don't adjust for inflation, don't do anything like this. This is what you see in American companies right now. Is we're getting lots and lots and lots of mergers, and you've got companies and things like that are merging, and they're not innovative. Like stuff like healthcare companies. Like the healthcare thing has been a big deal because they're very powerful politically. Like they have strong lobbies. They're deeply involved in politics. They get their tax breaks. They get their influence. But nothing in the healthcare industry, as far as insurance goes, is innovative. Like there is no insurance company, like whether you're with Cigna or Caremark or United Healthcare. None of them are innovative. Like they're not really doing anything to offer a better product. There's no competition. If one of those companies bought up all the other companies, nothing would happen. It's just that you would have rent seeking. Like the only way they can increase their profits is through rent seeking. They just charge more for a thing that you already had. So nothing is improved. Nothing is improved by these companies. So you had a lot of enterprises in China were just getting bought up by gigantic pre-existing wealth holders. And then they would just seek rent. Like they would sit on something, they wouldn't make any changes, they wouldn't make anything better, and they would just raise prices. They would just take more money, raise prices, they would seek rent. So they kept doing this, and you can see that during the Han Dynasty, during the later Han Dynasty, they kept trying to pass laws to limit exactly how much land any one family could own, because this was getting to be such a problem that it was starting to lead to food shortages and famines and things like that, or people couldn't afford food. You know, the poor would just be sitting around and, you know, they'd be working as hard as they can, but they no longer own their own farm because of this predatory lending thing, or because they needed money at one point and were, you know, had to sell the farm to make ends meet or something like that. And now there's just physically no way for them to keep up or for them to produce their own food. Whatever they produce doesn't belong to them anymore. It belongs to this family that bought their land. And so they get with the family, you know, they get the bones, and then they starve to death on these bones. So this is one of the big problems that plagued the Han Dynasty, the later Han. And then this led into the Romance of the Three Kingdoms era, which is very famous. If you've played the video games, read the books, anything like that, that's when you got just these three warring states that fought over the general territory of China for a great length of time. And then eventually they came back together in the Jin Dynasty briefly, but that sort of fell apart. From the Jin Dynasty is actually probably where we get the origin of the let them eat cake thing, except for instead of let them eat cake, it was if the poor don't have rice, let them eat beef. And then later on in France, it was if the poor don't have bread, let them eat cake. And today it's if the poor can't afford rent money, then if the poor can't afford rent, then let them drive their Cadillacs. You know, it's the same thing. You get this sort of, it's another one of those like historical sentiments. Like the more you read about history, the more you see the repetition, and you're just like, oh, yeah, that sounds like something I've heard before. Oh, I've heard that before too. Oh, there's that again. You know, you just see it happens over and over and over again. So just because you're seeing it, like, you know, in the BC era, and then you're seeing it again in politics today, it doesn't necessarily mean that anything is headed towards imminent political collapse. It just means that these sentiments have been present in general society for as long as history can remember. So, so the sort of elitism from the rich looking down on the poor and saying like, well, the poor are just poor because they're dumber than me. That's just like human nature. These are things that the rich will always say about the poor. The upper class will always say about the lower class. The lower class is filth. You know. Yes. So yes, just because the rich start doing that doesn't mean that we're on our way to another French Revolution. It just means that things are the same as they have always been. Yes. So anyway, though, but China's interesting because in spite of the fact that it collapsed, it never really quit being China. Like the Roman Empire collapsed, and there quit being a Rome, more or less. I mean, we have Italy now, but it later became the Holy Roman Empire, and then the Holy Roman Empire fell apart. So Rome collapsed. Like Rome collapsed, and then Rome was gone. And you know, and that's kind of how that went. But China collapsed, and then China reformed. And you could speculate as to why, but they believe that it's most likely because China had that very strong central bureaucracy, and it was a very functional system. I mean, when it was working well. I mean, like the former Han Dynasty was actually very efficient. They got a lot done. The system strove to be a meritocracy. There wound up being a lot of nepotism and just general human crap that caused the whole thing to decay. But it was a solid system, and so everyone who was warring to kind of take over China again, what they were sort of trying to do was restore the Han. In fact, if you know anything about the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, you might be aware that a lot of what the Three Kingdoms were trying to do was they were essentially trying to restore the Han. They were all claiming a certain amount of legitimacy in relation to the Han. The Mandate of Heaven comes up a lot. They talk about the Mandate of Heaven. The Mandate of Heaven is kind of this idea that the heavens themselves are compelling you to rule China. And it's kind of a vague idea, like nobody can actually hold the Mandate of Heaven. It's not a physical thing. It's just sort of this notion that whoever holds the Mandate of China is compelled to own China. China belongs to them. But historically, though, if you follow their culture, China has always been very authoritarian. They've always been very centralized, very bureaucratic. And this is why even today you hear about China doing things like they just go to a town and they say, we're going to put a shopping mall here, and they just take all the local peasantry and they just evict them. They just say, get out! China is building a shopping mall, and then they build a shopping mall, and there's nothing anyone can do or say about it. Like here in the States, we have eminent domain where that sort of thing is possible. But there's a little bit more involved, like you have to compensate people. Like you don't just show up and kick people out and tell them, like we'll give you scraps and you can take it or you can leave it. But if you stay here, we're going to run you over with tractors. Tractors with big shovels on the front that we call bulldozers. Yeah, those. So you don't see that quite as much in the States, but you do see that more in China because historically they've always been a little bit more authoritarian. And whether you look at the legalistic stuff or the Confucianistic stuff, they really don't focus very much on checks and balances or anything like that. Like Confucianism focuses on your place in the family and who has what power within the family, and then legalism focuses basically on the idea that the central government is to control everything and to keep order everywhere. And this arose because China actually went through lengthy periods of warfare and strife. There was a lot of conflict in China, and then again in the Romance era, and just over and over again you saw a lot of warfare and conflict in China. So they kind of value that bureaucracy, the concept of bureaucracy and order, a little bit higher than some other regions which got by a little bit more peacefully. Yes. So. So coming back to the States, we look at the States today, and I think that similar to China, there's a really strong sense of national identity. And if you were to ask the average American, like what would you do if you had to completely rebuild the U.S. government? You'd find that a lot of Americans, I think, would tell you that they would rebuild the U.S. to be almost identical to how it was. And in fact, you're seeing those people who really want a rebellion, who are like, Thomas Jefferson or somebody said that, was it Douglas Adams? The guy on the beer, he said, somebody said that we need to have a revolution every 200 years, and it's about time that we had a revolution. But what they always talk about is going back to the Constitution. They want to go back to the way the Constitution was. And this is a very kind of bizarre sort of ideological thing because the Constitution was designed to be altered. We are following the Constitution, and so it doesn't make any sense if you follow like strings of logic. But ideologically, basically what they want to do is they want to tear down the U.S. government and then replace it with the U.S. government. So even that's kind of a comical aspect of the U.S. Mentality. Is people who want to tear down the U.S. just actually want to rebuild the U.S. into the U.S. Like they don't really want to. They don't want to like. They still have a strong sense of national pride. Like they don't want to destroy the states. They just want the states to be their own particular version of the states. So yeah. But what's more important though about the idea of like the U.S. collapsing is the fact that there's really no powers in place that could take over any sort of power vacuum. Like everything is sort of set up to where there's branches and there's checks and balances, and things feel like unstable right now and a little bit hopeless right now. And if you look actually though at stability, what's the word? Like before I did this, I looked up some stuff about stability on the U.S. and what various institutions are saying about U.S. stability, and we're stable. I mean, like. Our country is solid, but if you look at Canada on a lot of the indexes had a much higher rating for stability than the US did. And this is just because Canada has a stronger banking system, like their bankings are Their banking system is safer. They've got less money in politics. They're all around. They're just a slightly more stable. They're much well. Some of them they were like twice as stable. Like if you could do that, the indexes are really weird and they involve a lot of math. It's all kind of arbitrary. But some of them were like, yeah, Canada's like twice as stable as the U.S. But of course, the U.S. has more money, and technology is moving forward so fast today that it's kind of awkward. Because you're looking at, like, we've got a lot of companies that are buying each other out. And clearly stuff like healthcare. The healthcare industry is toxic. Like, the healthcare industry is just eating people alive. It's rent-seeking. It's just wasting money. Like, the U.S. Health insurance program, it just sucks. Like, I think like, nothing I can ever read about it. Like, there's not really any economic theory that says anything other than that the U.S. healthcare system sucks. Like, it's way more expensive. It's just a ton of rent seeking. They're merging together, and they're really not getting more efficient. They're just being more expensive, and every year they get more expensive, like 20% more expensive, escalating out of control, just, you know, ridiculously. And our education system too. Actually, if you look at that, it's about the same. Is you're really not seeing our education system improving or being more efficient. But we do a lot of private education. And education is also just getting more and more expensive. Our education facilities are rent-seeking. They're just increasing the cost of education. You know, we need more money. We got to do this. We got to build a stadium. You know, we have all these sports programs, and we're going to try and get more people to come into our college to give us more money. You know, it's all a for-profit thing. But even if you had all these, like, universities don't merge so much, although there are some national chains. You know, I think like Phoenix and DeVry, I might be mistaken. There are some chains in the U.S. that are like, you know, kind of like, call it like diploma mills and stuff like that pop up all over the place. You just go and you get your diploma, you pay them a ton of money, and the diploma may or may not be worthwhile, but you know, you can give them ridiculous amounts of money. But the thing is that none of these colleges that we really have, the prestige mostly comes from the prestige, if that makes any sense. It's a little bit tautological. It's weird. Like, if you go to an Ivy League school, you aren't necessarily better educated than someone who went to, like, a state-level college. You might be. I mean, like, the professors are presumably more on the cutting edge in, like, an Ivy League school. But their methods of education aren't necessarily so much better than a state-level school that the state level won't educate you as well as a Ivy League. What's great about the Ivy League is that like a ton of rich, influential families go to the Ivy Leagues. So like if you go to Harvard, you know, you might be going to the same family as like you might meet like the Clintons or like the Bushes or another influential political family. Somebody like you might become friends with somebody with a lot of money and a lot of power. And this is kind of what's really big about the Ivy League schools. This is why it's important to get in the Ivy League, is it's not so much because the education will be so much phenomenally better, but it's because people recognize the Ivy Leagues as being better. So like an employer will say, oh, Harvard, like that's really competitive, you know, you must be a very competitive person. Or they assume you know people or something like that. Your education will be somewhat similar. So yeah, education is not really innovating, but its prices are going up, and this is another thing, you get this rent seeking. This is kind of weird. And our politics is being strangled by those groups as well, though. Because of the rent seeking, they're able to achieve more money, and this is getting into this really frustrating cycle. Every time I read about this, it's like, yeah, the health insurance companies are rent seeking and they're becoming more and more expensive, 20% more expensive every year, and then they turn around and they take those new profits and they just pour them back into politics, and they say like, oh, you know, we need more tax exemptions. Like, if you want us to be, you know, more affordable, we're gonna need more breaks, we're gonna need more tax exemptions. And when the government came around and said like, well, what if we create like a federal health care plan? They freaked out and they were like, no, we could never compete with a federal healthcare system. I mean, the federal healthcare system would be able to negotiate across the nation. Like, they would objectively have the lowest possible prices. They would actually tamp down on the rising cost of healthcare. Like, we can't have that. Like, we would be destroyed. We would get slaughtered in the market. So the government said, well, okay, we won't do a federal healthcare plan. We'll do Obamacare instead. So we got Obamacare. But yes, like I say though, you look at all this and you just kind of look at the way that we can't seem to pass any law that controls the power of wealthy entities. And after Citizens United, it's become possible for the rich to actually just pour stupid amounts of money into elections. And so now we've got the Republicans running with like 13 people all trying to get in. A lot of them have dropped out, but I feel like people aren't really stupid, you know, like they kind of look at this and they know exactly why there are so many different Republican contenders. And they're looking at the options and you've got like, okay, so it's like Hillary Clinton versus whatever generic Republican guy gets in. And the Republicans they're pro-rich and they want to pass laws that will help the rich and they're going to help their corporations and they're going to help their campaign donors. And you kind of look at like, you've got Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders is like a super dark horse, but he's gotten a lot of public support. And he's raised like a ridiculous amount of money through individual donations. Like this, he's actually broken records with how many individual donations he's gotten. And I don't believe that he's actually taken any campaign donations from like large corporations. He's run into a little bit of weird stuff. Like for example, he's been cut off from his campaign data by the Democratic National Committee, and there have been some other things that have popped up in the news. But then there's Hillary Clinton, and Hillary Clinton is just like as establishment as they come. You know, she used to work for Walmart. You know, she's gonna get in there and she's gonna be very pro-corporate. And I don't doubt that she'll absolutely approve any kind of free trade agreement or anything like that. She's in favor of that kind of stuff. She's just like the Republicans, going to pass laws that favor her campaign donors and her wealthy friends and the elites, and and she may not cut taxes for the upper class, but she's probably, like the Democrats are weird because they always come up with some kind of tax scheme that fundamentally helps the rich, like in the long run, in whatever kind of like loopy sort of way. It's like they tax the rich a little bit more, but then they also tax like the middle and lower class. Like they apply more taxes to the middle class, and then they take that money and they just give it back to the rich. So there's like a net gain, for the upper. It seems to be how it always goes. There's no politician who's really there for the middle or lower class. They're all there kind of for themselves and their friends and what it is that they want to do. So the Trump thing, people are doing this. Like I said, I think that people aren't really stupid. They get the sense of this, and they're seeing Trump get up there. And if you listen to what Trump is saying, he's basically just going up and he's going, everything is stupid, politicians are stupid, everything's going bad, I hate everything, throw that person out of this, throw that person out, I hate everything, throw that person out, I hate everything, throw that person out. And people love this because people agree, everything is terrible. This is one of these things, like a lot of people will agree with that sentiment. Trump doesn't actually seem to put forward a lot of solutions. In fact, almost every solution he's put forward is always something that produces a lot of anger, like, like the fence thing, or the, let's make it to where Muslims can't be in the country anymore. He proposed that. Almost all of his proposals are some, like, super unpopular, terrible thing. But he talks more about what he hates than about what he, like, approves of. So people all kind of, like, you get the cheers, like, I hate this. And everyone's like, yeah, we hate that too. Oh, I hate that. And then, he just keeps going. And then he gets caught up throwing people out of his speeches. You never know what exactly, you don't really know what exactly Trump is going to do, but most likely, he always sounds super uninformed. Like, anytime he talks about an actual plan, it always sounds like it sounds like nobody told him about, like, the state of the world or anything like that. like my favorite one is, like, his justification for wanting to throw all the Muslims out of the country is he goes, we need to throw out all the Muslims until we know what's going on in the Middle East. And it's like, you could read some of the reports. Like, if you really want to know what's going on in the Middle East, like, we have people that keep track of that, and they do reports on it, so we sort of know what's going on in the Middle East. And when you say Middle East, like, which particular Middle East are you talking about? Like, Morocco? Istanbul? Like, which of the Muslim countries are you super, super concerned about? So you kind of get this idea, like, Trump is just talking about, like, we don't know what's going on in the Muslim countries, and it's like, no. Like, Morocco is a pretty firm trading partner with the EU. You could just go to Morocco and ask them. They would know. Like Istanbul, too, or not Istanbul, Turkey, Istanbul, the capital. Turkey, it's like Turkey trades with the EU, there are Muslim countries that are not in the middle of political turmoil or so much, as it were. And, they do stuff with the West, and so you could actually just go to their country and, like, meet with their leaders and just be like, hello, what's going on with you people? And they'd be like, well, not much right now. We're working on this and this tax plan, and we're gonna put down some roads, and this is kind of how it is. So yeah, political collapse. I don't think the U.S. is headed towards political collapse, but we're seeing a lot of like really weird oddities in the country anyway. And there are a lot of people who think we're going to collapse. And I think that perception that the U.S. is going to collapse is probably, it's influencing politics quite a lot. And a lot of politicians right now, they're not doing anything to calm people down about the concern that the U.S. is spiraling out of control. I keep seeing this sentiment too, like so many people are just like, we're the Roman Empire, we're falling apart, we're the Roman Empire, we're all gonna die. And like Clinton was like one of the last politicians that I would want up on a stage saying, don't worry everybody, we're not gonna keep going in the direction we are, because Clinton is like so ridiculously rank and file. Like, you just couldn't believe that coming out of her mouth. Like, you can't, I will no longer support Walmart. I disavow their practices and everything like that. It was like, well, you were on the board of directors when they were destroying unions and things like that. Like, well, aren't you just going to do Clinton things when you get elected? And the Republicans, same way. It's like they can't get up there and be like, all right, everyone, I know that you're really sick of Comcast, so I'm going to do something about Comcast. Like, you get this, like, companies like Comcast. And for some reason, our country just can't do anything about this is the nation's most hated company. Like, no company is more hated than Comcast. And we had to basically scream at the FCC. Like, we had to send them, how much junk mail did we dump on them? It was like millions of emails or something like that, or at least, like, close to 1 million at least. 2 million, I can't remember what the exact number was, but like the FCC showed up and they were like looking at Comcast and they were like, well, gee, I don't know, it doesn't look that bad. I think that maybe we could get rid of net neutrality, and I think Comcast will just be trusted to regulate itself. And they got like 1 million emails, 1 million angry emails from people just being like, no, Comcast can't be trusted. Are you insane? What is wrong with you? And so they had to twist the FCC's arm and just be like, there's no way. If you allow Comcast to stay the way they are, there is no way that you can say that you're not just trying to help Comcast and get yourself a nice cushy job after you're done working for the FCC. So they had to turn around and they had to say, well, okay, maybe we'll think about some regulations for Comcast, I guess, if we have to. But it just takes that ridiculous level of public outrage to get them to even make like the most paltry actions against these major corporations. And I don't think that, I think that we're going to continue to read for like at least the next, at least another decade. We're going to just continue to read about like angry responses to Comcast's crap. Like, we're going to continue to see them like putting data caps, and the data caps are going to be like unreasonable, and people are going to be like, well, I'm getting hit with, it's just going to be rent seeking. It's going to be that same thing. Like, Comcast is if they're going to innovate at all, it's going to innovate at like a massive cost, like an overinflated cost. It's not like they're going to become the best company or the most competitive company. They're just going to be like this bloated monopoly because when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to something like roads, waterways, electricity, stuff like that, generally the largest and most financially efficient system is a monopoly. And this is why you often hand these things over to government control. And this is why a lot of European countries take things like internet or school or water or fire departments and all that stuff, and they make it state run. Because the state may not be super efficient, the state may be prone to embezzling. I'm not saying the state is really the best way to do things, and the state may not be very innovative, but at least it may not seek rent to the insane degree that like just a corporate monopoly will. And like the rules are consistent, for everybody. It's not like you just have like one region where they're just like, yeah, we're gonna have these really crappy data cap. We're gonna have these awful data caps in like I don't know, like Washington, but everywhere else, like, we're not gonna have crappy data caps, and we're just gonna see how pissed off people get in Washington. We're gonna see if we get away with it, and if we get away with it, we're gonna transfer this over to a national level, and so on and so forth. I don't know, like, you can't just like imagine if Comcast were run by the state. Like, if it were a state institution, and it were like the most unpopular state institution in the entire world, like it was beating the IRS in terms of how angry people were at it. Politicians would be compelled. You could just imagine the promises, like, I will fix this state internet thing, and people would vote for that. Like, seriously, if you had politicians who could get up and they would say, like, I will fix Comcast. Like, I am going to pass a law that makes Comcast not suck. People would vote for that. There'd be people behind it. But currently you can't, because Comcast is highly influential. They're just weird. So yes. So again, coming back to the political stability thing, like I say, I think that we're too integrated. We're too reliant on everybody. If for whatever reason, if one day, like, California just, like, up and rebelled, like, I can't imagine how California would be able to mobilize into, like, a full rebellion. But if, like, California just seceded from the Union one day, just, like, picked up an army and was just like, that's it, we're getting out, we're leaving. California is, like, a major source of food for the nation, and so, like, it would be a huge, catastrophic problem. Same for, like, a lot of the states in the Midwest, and it's kind of funny, because this is another thing that Europeans don't understand, is that a lot of European nations, they're much more densely populated, and so things are a little bit more homogenous. And so you look at, say, gun control, and you say, oh, you know, like in Europe, we can all just pass gun control. Well, yeah, that's possible. I mean, if you look at a state-by-state level, we all have states like Oklahoma can pass their own state gun control, and that works. Like, they get something pushed through. But on the federal level, like, you're looking like Alaska has very particular rules on guns, but they have a very small population density. There's a lot of wilderness out in Alaska, so they don't mind if you carry guns in Alaska. It's not such a big deal. But then in, like, you know, the concentrate, like in New York, which is much more heavily populated, people are concentrated in a much denser area, and there's not, like, wild polar bears or anything like that roaming around eating people. You know, New York, much more strict about guns. So, you know, we're more heterogeneous. We're not totally, we don't all have the same needs across our massive stretch of territory in the States. So there's a certain sense of discombobulation when you look at our politics, but I don't know, we're a very nationalistic country. I think in some cases, a ridiculously nationalistic country, if you really follow our talk and our opinions. And like I say, ask just about any American, how would you rebuild the U.S.? And whatever they describe to you would sound super similar to the U.S. It would be about the same thing, unless they're like really young and they don't know much about politics. In which case they'd just be like, I believe in a fully democratic system, and it would be like, but how would we build the roads? And I'd be like, oh man, we'd have to have a little bit of bureaucracy, I guess, a little bit of centralized power, just a smidge of it. But yeah. Anyway, though, it's just something I was thinking about with some little odds and ends and lots of sort of tangents on the whole thing. But political instability. The U.S. is stable. Lots of people think we're falling apart. I don't think we are. I worry a lot about what exactly we're going to be doing over the next couple of years. I mean, like, politics doesn't feel like it's getting better. It feels like it's getting worse. And sometimes I used to end these and I'd say, like, well, you know, there's people who are aware of the problems and they're working to fix them. But then I hear about, like, Congress passing another law to further loosen campaign financing laws, and it's just like, never mind. Like, never mind. They're not making it better. It's not getting better. It doesn't feel like it's getting better. It feels like it's just getting stupider. But I also don't feel like if we did vote Trump into office, I feel like our diplomatic situation would decay rapidly. Like, we would lose a lot of friends on an international scale. But I don't think that the president would have enough power to actually, like, derail the country. Like, I don't think we're going to become fascist overnight or anything like that. This will be something, if we eventually become, like, a bizarre fascist shell of our former selves, it's going to be over another generation or two, I think. It's got to be. Because the system has not corroded to that point to where we could just become fascist. Like, we're established with a ridiculous number of checks and balances for a reason, and for better or worse, it's holding us together, even if our leaders want to tear each other apart. So yes, I suppose that's it for today. Thanks for joining me, everybody. I'll catch you all next time.